Good evening. Every lecture I have to introduce myself, but sometimes I'm sure that the people get really tired of hearing me introducing myself. Like, my name is Sherrerd, chair of the UCLA Architecture and Urban Design. I have to actually inform, before I introduce our lecturer today, I'd like to mention that next Monday, February 6th, Joe Day will lecture about his work. And also I'm pleased to inform you that the work fix of will take place for February 24th, Friday. So please come to join us for these two lectures. I was in my office with today's speaker, and I was suggested that I should say something very personal, but I'm a little bit scared to say something personal because I might make a horrible mistake because of English. So I won't, but maybe if I have a little more wine, I will say it. But to me, he is the architect of Los Angeles. That's, I have no doubt. But I came here back in the 80s, and I saw his work as a student, and he produced. The sensation I got is very much embedded in the image, as an image of Los Angeles. So that's the one thing that I would say about his work. And therefore it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter, Frederick Fisher, to you tonight. And we said also that the reception in the gallery after this lecture, and to honor his accomplishment, and also he's one of the greatest alumni we have from our department. Established in 2009, the UCLA Architecture and Urban Design Distinguished Alumni Lecture Series features renowned graduates whose innovation and accomplishment have significantly impacted the field of architecture and/or urban design. Frederick Fisher leads a practice focused on art, academic institutions, and residence, and Fred received his Bachelor of Arts from Oberlin College in Art and Master of Architecture from UCLA. Artist collaboration is a career-long commitment. Fred was awarded for Franklin D. Israel Loan Prize in 2008. Recent projects include Annenberg Community Beach House, Princeton's Sherrerd Hall, and Caltech's Annenberg Center for Information Science and Technology. The renovation of Princeton's Firestone Library and A.Q. Jones' Sunnylands is also completed and opens in March. Fisher's watercolors are exhibited at the Cella Gallery, and Otis College's Maltz Gallery presented an installation based on his Rome sketchbook. Delight motivates Fisher's practice, creating a framework for art and a picturesque relationship with the nature and constant forms. Explicit construction and an aesthetics of assemblage enrich the loft sensibility of flexible space and enduring minimal forms that support creative living and working environments. Architecture is a device for mending the disjunctions of contemporary life through relationship and memory rather than expressive them. Please join me in welcoming Frederick Fisher.
Appreciate that very much, and I also appreciate what you're doing with the school in the vision and the energy and the reinvigoration of the school that you've done in the last 5 years. I think is very impressive, and I really appreciate you bringing me back here to talk. In the spirit of the awards season, I of course have to thank the people who make it all possible. It's great to see some of the friends and from many different quarters here tonight. I was not one of the great fans of the collaborative projects, of which I think there's quite a bit going on now. But one realizes in the real world it is all about collaboration. And I've had the fortune of practicing with two tremendous architects, David Ross and Joe Coriati, who have been with me for almost or around 30 years and who make these projects possible. And the kind of intangible chemistry between people, which, as you know, is very hard to maintain over a long period of time, I think has been one of the successes of our practice together is the difference between our personalities and our skills and how that applies to our clients and the projects. And I also want to thank my wife, Jenny, and our boys that keep me sane and are patient during all the travel and provide some needed perspective and constructive criticism. As Toshi said, our practice has really been involved with art from the beginning, and you might say it's because I was a frustrated artist. My father was an architect, and I was determined not to be an architect because he would come home every night and complain about the clients and the contractors and how miserable it was, and I thought, why do you do this? It's so agonizing. And so I went to art. I went to Oberlin College and studied art and art history, and liked them both a lot. And I wasn't particularly good at either one of them. And I realized I didn't have the academic discipline for art history or the blank canvas skills for fine arts, and that I needed problem solving as a pragmatic Midwesterner and the son of an architect who did hospitals. I needed the problems to solve and the specific conditions to bump against in order to find my place in that creative realm. And so after and while going to school here, I hung out with artists, and so I would vicariously stay involved in the visual arts by being friends with the artists, going to openings and then looking at the art. And that, one thing leads to another. My very first project was for an artist friend, Elsa Rady, who's an artist, just passed away recently, an exquisite artist in porcelain. And I'm not going to show it, but my first house was kind of the opposite of that. It was a collage-like facade, a very complicated juxtaposition of materials and colors and textures. I had spent a couple of years in Frank Gehry's office and just come out of schools, and I think, as in the case of a lot of first projects, there were just too many ideas for one poor little house. But working with Elsa was a great cleansing experience for that, because as the artist, as probably any artist would have said, you know what, it's not about you, it's about my work and my sense of place and quiet. And so even though it was quite a modest project, it was a turning point for me, in that it opened up this other side of seeing architecture as a framing device and as a background and not just as the subject matter. Over the years, that led to a number of projects, and PS1 being one of the larger ones, where that sense of remembering that the art space is about the artist and it's about the art and it's a frame and not the subject has been one of the key themes in our work. So maybe you'll recognize some of these people. This is 1980. There's Coy Howard, Craig Hodgetts, myself, Bob Mandurian, Eric Moss, and the nice simple Sam Tai, Frank Gehry, and Tom Main on the beach, taken by Tim Street Porter. And this was, a lot of fun. And as Satoshi said, that it was a very fun, lively time in California architectural history. People called us the Gehry kids, and people were trying to figure out what this California school was. and then I'll show you one school project. This was a second-year project I did here. It was for a solar-powered crematory. And one of the things I loved about the faculty at that time was that half of the people said, you know, you're a smart aleck, stop it, and then the other half were cheering me on. And that kind of diversity and kind of diametrically opposed opinions I thought was extremely healthy, because you could, on one hand, always find somebody that would be in your face and pushing back at you, and at the same time always find somebody that would empathize and support you. So a couple of years ago, I was realizing that when we were talking to our clients and ourselves about what we're trying to do, that there were the same themes that were coming up over and over again, which I think is a good thing. And so I did a sort of a virtual book of 10 chapters on the 10 ideas that we find we continually base our work on. And I'm just going to run through those, and then you'll see how those things, to greater or lesser degrees, show up in work in different ways. Going back to that pragmatic Midwestern aspect, use is always paramount. And the notion that what takes place in a space conditions it, not that it needs to condition a space specifically, but it needs to, the space needs to be a frame for that. And one of the things about Japanese architecture is that it's a neutral space, and that the rooms are not designed necessarily specifically for different functions, but it happens whether you pull the tatami mat, how many tatami mats you pull in, whether you put the teapot in it, or whether you roll out the bedroll, as to whether it's a living room or a dining room or a reception room. And some of those notions of use are highly fetishized, such as this overly scaled and decorated hook holding the teapot. Allusions to nature can be brought in, such as the sand, the waves, sand pattern. And although we don't cook with a fireplace anymore, certain things of archaic history in humanity, such as the hearth, remain as strong cultural conditioners in how we think about using space. Setting, of course, is absolutely essential, in particular to our work. This is a Bernard Maybeck campsite that replaced a camp that was burned down in a fire. And what resonated with me was the notion that it was literally made of the site, the rocks from the site were built up, and then in a very primitive way, and then this light corrugated metal roof structure was set down on it. And this notion of heavy and light resting on heavy, is something that we come back to over and over again, and also the contrast of primitive and industrial. Collage was always my favorite form of artwork, and I felt like architecture was inherently a collage-based media, and so that first house I did expressed that quite explicitly in the facade, and not getting away from the notion of building as a foam core, as an abstract foam core model, and but as an assemblage of real world pieces. Secondly, fourthly, the notion of surface. Japanese art hit European art dramatically in the late 19th century, and particularly affected artists like Van Gogh, who responded to the two-dimensionality, the lack of traditional Western perspective, the lack of shade and shadow and depth in traditional Western terms. And that notion of two-dimensionality in a way axonometric space as opposed to perspectival space is something that is of continued interest to us. Threshold, framing, another way of framing space, and of using the limits of a threshold or a window to intensify the view and often to flatten it, that visually, and some of the artists we work with, like Eric Orr, would use this device. You can make a three-dimensional scene look two-dimensional as how you delimit the frame. And essentially this view to the outside becomes a two-dimensional picture in this pattern on the wall. Interestingly, also in 1980, when I was living in Venice, I was riding my bike down the street one day, and I passed the Melinda Wyatt Gallery, and the Melinda Wyatt Gallery was gone, and all it was this empty storefront with a scrim stretched across it. There was no name, there was no identification as to what it was, and it turned out it was a Robert Irwin installation that lasted for about 2 weeks. And it was an early demonstration of the notion of art as an experience as opposed to art as an object. And that has been very influential, and again, it relates to that notion, the art notion of the architecture as the frame as opposed to the object. Temporality came out of my art history days and the interest in Victorian art and architecture, and the romance of the ruin. And it's also a meditation on nature and how that nature does, and will eventually overwhelm all the works of mankind, and that we have to always keep in mind the temporality, the temporariness of what we do in relationship to the greater time spans of nature. Archetype, the application of simple repetitive forms developed over indigenous forces of construction and function over time that in this example make up a Shaker village where the boxes of all the same type are actually literally color-coded according to function and with differentiation according to their how they materials and the internal arrangements that come from their functionality, while the containers are remaining constant. That also relates to these notions of scale and taxonomy, and the notion of big and small, and of small within big. In this case, this Dutch house of a guild house, essentially symbolizing all the individual houses that occur within this larger house at the urban scale. Taxonomy, this is the Blossfeld, actually it's sort of a layout that he did when he was composing his negatives and prints. He was a Berliner educator in art, and his theories were based on the notion of that all the forms of art stem from nature. And his work eventually influenced the Beckers and the whole tradition of German photographers and artists. This is Don Judd's work in Marfa, Texas. And one of our clients for a house was talking about how they would imagine their house. They're art collectors, and they were talking about their affection for this powerful work of Judd's of these concrete cubes rotated in different directions with different kinds of configurations of the surfaces out in nature, and contemplating that and how could that be translated into architecture. And that led to this house in Manhattan Beach. It's made up of 3 cubes. And there's a cube of the living spaces. There's a cube of the wet spaces, the kitchen and the bathroom, and then there's a cube of the guest quarters. And those things are stacked slightly disarranged along a tight lot in Manhattan Beach. And that notion of the framing, also the influence of somebody like McCracken, was used to kind of turn around the traditional notion of a beachfront house where one would want the vast panorama of the ocean. And having lived at that site for quite a long time, they felt that they agreed they didn't need to look at the whole beach all the time. And the windows were actually a series of slots that become quite abstract when they're narrowed, and again, they lose that sense of depth and become quite two-dimensional and essentially almost another artwork leaning against the wall. We collaborated with an artist, Roy McMakin, who came at the project from a completely opposite sensibility, the notion of sentiment and memory and emotion. He designed this traditional fireplace and this traditional balustered staircase that sat in these abstract concrete boxes like toys of another era and sensibility. That Maybeck house, that was in the back of our minds when we thought about this house, this studio actually for Don Chadwick, who's the designer of the Aeron chair in Sullivan Canyon, and the notion of the heavy base, the masonry base that grows out of the house, and the light domestic form sitting on top of that, bending the house according to the shape of the site, and then creating this loft-like within this house-like shape, this loft-like interior. A few years later, he and his wife came back to us and said they'd lived in a house on that site for 35 years, and decided they wanted a new house, but they didn't want to leave the site. So we designed this house as an abstraction and as a complement to the other building. In this case, a light metal structure which just hovers above the ground and plays with those simple bent shapes, but eliminates that house-like roof line and that layering of the heavy and light materials. The notion of threshold and framing was applied to this house in Inez Valley. When one is in a setting like this, it's pretty difficult to compete with that kind of nature. And we felt that it would be best to apply the kind of simple barn-like materials. This is corrugated Corten steel, and a very archetypal floor plan of the pure gravel garden in the center of composed nature amidst the setting of the untouched nature surrounding it. And the house being this framework, the domestic spaces are the frame that is the space between the outer landscape and the inner landscape. So each part of the house has the sculpted, composed inner garden, and then frames these views to the uncultivated outer landscape. Recently, a couple of days ago, we sent off a project to Istanbul where we were asked to help a developer rethink what is happening in not just Istanbul, but in these megacities which are growing exponentially with massive in-migrations and literally needing to house tens of millions of people in very short periods of time. And this is the kind of development that's growing in the outskirts of Istanbul literally by the week. There's a piece of land overlooking a reservoir, and the developer is interested in trying to find a lower density kind of housing that relates more to the topography and those kinds of intimate social spaces that you might say are an enlargement of the last house I showed, of the controlled inner spaces, fairly high density but low-rise apartments gathered around those spaces, and then allowing fingers of the natural landscape to run through this complex. The notion of context within a college campus takes on an interesting urban quality in that each generation in college campuses tends to plan in their own way. And we had a project at Princeton that sat on a courtyard that had a couple of postmodern buildings from the 80s, a Hugh Stubbins building from the 70s, and a Harry Cobb building just a couple of years ago. And we realized that what we needed to respond to was the space in between those buildings rather than those buildings themselves. Princeton prides itself on the integration of its campus, and yet that's quite a struggle when you're dealing with all these different eras of architecture. So we took this, looked at the space in between the Stubbins building, which is essentially this brick box floating on a plinth, and then the Harry Cobb building, which is a glass box floating on a stone plinth, and made another glass box that related to the proportions of the Stubbins building and the Harry Cobb building, and literally the bricks that those buildings of the Stubbins building are made out of. And as the academic discipline is operations, research, and financial engineering, we talked to them about the expression of that ethos in the building. And one of the things they don't have a lot of on Princeton is glass boxes. And yet we felt that the notion of transparency was essential in dealing with what is Princeton's equivalent of a business school and a school that studies the economics and the relationship between social issues and economics. And at the same time, building itself would become literally a mirror of the college, of the campus, and so it would be both there and not there in terms of reflecting its environment, and then take on this lantern-like quality at night. We expressed the entrance to the building and the social space in the building, which is an atrium behind it, as we called it a brooch on the front of the building, and that collage-like application of two-dimensional surfaces allowed the building to reach out to this campus walkway in front of this generic glass facade, and yet it dissolves visually. It dissolves at night as you light behind it. The surface of the space is layered not only with the views of nature, and we wanted people to reflect on, even with the hard rectilinear quality of the building, to be constantly reflective on nature, the changing patterns of the sky and the landscape around it. And then filter that view from the inside with a frit pattern that would be needed for the energy model, but also to soften the windows like like lace curtains that you might hang in front of it. And so these marks actually come from a Japanese brush stroke, and those were a pattern that varied in density depending on its position on the building, and gave you a layer of foreground through which to view the outside landscape. Just inside the front door, we wanted to energize, bring together the people, the inhabitants of the building, the visitors of the building. So we combined the front door with the main staircase, with an atrium and all the circulation to try, and the users responded to bring together the energy and essentially force what Quincy Jones used to refer to as the serendipitous encounter, which is so essential to creative thinking. We introduced the idea, Princeton had never done it before, of commissioning an artist to do a piece in a building, and we got James Iserman involved. This is his model, and he was first presenting it to the museum director. And he designed essentially a chandelier that was based on the geometry of the building. And that project, which was quite challenging for the university at first, has now been embraced, and they're now involving artists in all their new projects. This office shows you that framing device, the threshold of snapping the outside views up against the surface of the window by compressing it. The building also had the nature of it was a simple box, and the university essentially asked us, is there another way to do a university building besides these very expensive custom buildings? And with the tight stripe, the tight site, the tight budget, led us to do what we call a packing problem, is keep the box extremely simple and then allow there to be quite a lot of variety that actually can change through time, since the institutions, particularly nascent institutions like this initiative at Princeton, would have the ability to change and flex and grow and within the building without expensive remodels or affecting the outside envelope. So we applied that to our next project at Caltech, the Institute for Science and Technology. And our contextual response there was similar, the notion of dissolving the building into the landscape, and we became a little bit more literal with that, taking the branches from the local olive trees and scanning the colors and coming up with a color palette from the bark and the branches and the both underside and upper side of the leaves that we use for the glass, the spandrel glass patterns. And then we took from the Mediterranean early architecture of Gordon Kaufman and Bernard Maybeck on the campus the notion of the external staircase, and projected those outside the building, which also helped us quite a bit with the efficiency of the building, and created the social spaces on the outside that are, again, conditioned for that theater of the serendipitous encounter. This is the entry of the building. It's essentially stretched halfway across the facade. We took a virtual cow path that used to go across the site and allowed that to continue to run through the building as a campus path, and then scooped up the traffic from the parking lots, and so the faculty and students who are the day-to-day users of the building basically entered from the outside to the upper levels, and then people that would come in for lectures, workshops, used the grounds level as what we call the town square of computer labs, conference rooms, lecture hall, all of which were transparent to the outside to keep those people and activities in connection to the outside life of the campus. As well, the giant server room in the building sits basically like a big refrigerator on there, reminding everybody of what literally powers the activity of that building. On the upper level is an atrium that serves all these sets of studios. The building operates on, as much of Caltech does, on a series of faculty initiative. These are grant-driven projects, and a faculty will assemble a team that might work together for a couple of years on a project, and they essentially get their own living room, and we put a purposefully domestic feeling to these, and all of those living rooms would look out into this atrium on the upper level, not quite in the main campus flow of traffic, but all keeping eyes on each other and screened somewhat by this laser-cut bamboo screen, which was generated by one of the faculty members through a random line recursion pattern. We asked them what was fundamentally alike to all the activities that went on in the building, and after thinking for a while, the faculty member said, well, recursion is the activity that the computer goes through to generate virtually everything we do. And so this is a random line pattern. It's actually one picture with holes cut out of it. And then I think from our experience in domestic work, one of the things that we look at in evaluating a site is what are the amenities that we can grab and pull into the space to enhance it. And we knew that from the upper level there was going to be an unbelievable view of the San Gabriel Mountains. And so we created this loft-like space for the primary users of the building on this one corner that we knew, we call it the tree house, sitting it, basically pushing it into the upper part of the trees and warming it up with this bamboo paneling and opening it up to these beautiful views with more domestic furniture, more domestic-like furniture than they would ordinarily expect in the institutional environment. The next building we're working on is for a science building for a secondary school fronting a freeway, and this building, which is just in concept design now, not even in schematics yet, is intended to be basically a living laboratory for the different physical sciences and biological sciences. The notion of memory that Hitoshi referred to is one that is recurrent in our work. This is the Marion Davis William Randolph Hearst mansion on Santa Monica Beach, which was torn down after the Northridge earthquake. And this is the guest house, which is a national landmark building designed by Julia Morgan in the background. And when we approached this project, we heard a lot of things from the community, as you can only imagine, because in Santa Monica, everybody gets to have an opinion. And one of the ideas was that we rebuild this in glass. That wouldn't have cost too much, but the heart of the idea was right, in that there needed to be a memory of this great structure here. And so we created what we called the ghost of that mansion, which is this series of columns, which are the same spacing, the same height and proportion of the original colonnade of the building. And so it's as if you left the columns and took everything else away. It also had a nice relationship to the palm trees on top of the palisades. It's actually, if you've been there, the Annenberg Community Beach House, it's not a big program. It sits on a fairly large site, so we could easily fit that on the ground level. But we realized that one of the key experiences of that would have been Marion Davies and her guests on the porch on the second floor overlooking that colonnade and the pool. And so we put a room up on the second, and a deck on the second floor behind that colonnade to recreate that experience. We also had to knit together back on the beach, which was, actually our site ended there, so it's not part of our project, but it's attached to it. The historic pool, which is a national landmark and had to be restored. And then the Julia Morgan House, which is also a national landmark. Knit together with, as if you look at the building from the back, a tilt-up concrete wall. One of the first things which we all recognized was that the site was you almost couldn't have a conversation on the site when in its previous incarnation, because the traffic noise from PCH is so loud. And so this concrete wall acts primarily as a stone buffer, and then physically ties together all these pieces. We worked with Roy McMakin on an art piece that sort of sentimental, again in his kind of sweet sentimental way, recalls the history of the site, the notions of domesticity and of scale. So on the right is the view from what would have been the deck of the porch in Marion Davies' bedroom in the original house. Just completed is a set of gallery spaces at the Descanso Gardens. Again, in a historic building, the Bodie House, which was the original resident on that property. The institution wanted to bring itself into the art world with a kind of museum quality presentation of artwork, and needing totally different kinds of spaces, but they had to work with literally what was the garage of the building, which couldn't be changed. We tucked a gallery behind that and dug it into the hill and put a few galleries inside, but realizing within these small spaces that we wouldn't have, they would have to remain intimate galleries. So we thought about the way of putting light into those spaces in the most quiet, intimate way possible. I was inspired by the lighting that we saw at Caesar's Madre in Naples, and how the light is basically leaked in around the edges of the wall, and of course the Turrell-like box of light bringing daylight into the room. and trying to put, as we to characterize it, light rather than lighting in these gallery spaces. Another museum project which is in construction, and again, the dealing with the challenge of campus architecture at Colby College. You have a campus which is struggling to maintain its colonial federal style architecture, and yet you see what happens over periods of decades when different architects from different eras add all manner of different projects, particularly in a museum, which museums virtually always grow every 30 years, and each generation has its own strikingly different architecture. So we've actually done 2 additions to that museum previously, and we went back to the origins. We basically told them that you needed to do a building, that the addition to look like it was the first building on campus rather than the last building. And so these are these very simple Monopoly House-like pavilions that bookended the campus. But when they received a very large collection of American art by a donor, they needed a much larger building that could be accommodated in these kinds of pavilions. And so the new building that we're doing, again, takes the strategy of dissolving the building into the landscape and as a skyscape with a glass prism. And the building essentially is visually a non-building. We take the end of the building and instead of commissioning a work, they actually had a Sol LeWitt wall drawing in their collection, which we're using on the outside as the kind of lantern icon for the entry to the museum. And then in the entry plaza, there's a Richard Serra set of steel cubes. Back at Princeton, the Firestone Library is kind of beloved and hated by the people there. Everybody has fond memories of it. But it's a glorious Gothic revival building, but it's also 1948. It was the kind of last gasp of the Gothic revival, sitting next to Ralph Adams Cram's chapel, and yet on the inside it was basically an industrial building, and it was quite visionary at the time, and it was planned as a flexible loft-style building. Inside, it's 400,000 square feet. 50% of the program is actually underground, and so while it has this kind of frontage, it's quite utilitarian on the inside. And so we were trying to find a bridge or a way of maintaining the duality of that, respecting both its cathedral-like quality and yet its trying to renew their affection for the mid-century, which is challenging because there's quite a bit of sentiment for that Gothic revival, and yet there's a beauty to that pragmatic proto-modernism of the late 40s that we felt could be recalled and redeveloped into the fabric of the building on the inside. And part of that had to do with how we deal with light, which was, again, using these techniques of the light rather than lighting as the way of moving you through the building and identifying the pieces. This is basically the quality of the spaces that they have had. It was basically like working in the lower decks of an aircraft carrier. These ceilings are 7.5 feet tall because there was no reason to have it any taller than that because you couldn't reach the bookshelves. And the study carrels were literally, steel cells with rolling doors, and those nice aluminum Amico chairs which are so cold to sit on. So our strategy is to kind of breathe in the domestic quality into this space, keeping with the palette of, in a way, we're trying to bridge the gap between the clubby quality of institutions like Princeton and yet that utilitarian, early mid-century quality that the building was actually part of the building's DNA. bringing the domesticity into things like particularly the lighting, chandeliers and table lamps, carving penetrations into the ceiling to drop light across stone surfaces. The building had been added to numerous times, as most of those buildings have been. And carving wells within the building so that there would be intercommunication from one part of the building to another, and a relief from those relentless hundreds of thousands of square feet of 7.5-foot ceilings. And using light as an orientation device and providing a grain to the building so that, again, it's quite easy to get lost in these vast windowless stacks, and providing these spines of light to move you through the building. One of the fortuitous encounters I had early on in the time I was in Los Angeles was with Elaine Jones, who was the widow of A. Quincy Jones. And Elaine and Quincy had a wonderful salon, and it was a part of the community of architecture in the building that they referred to as the Barn. You can see it today on Santa Monica Boulevard, just west of Century City. And that building was their home. It was also a studio and a gathering point of that wonderful optimistic time. They were close friends of the Edens, where the art community, the design community, the music community, art community, and architecture were all brought together in this kind of optimistic moment of the early modernist days in Los Angeles. We fortunately had the opportunity to acquire Quincy's office building, which is also on Santa Monica Boulevard, just west of Bundy, and this is where our offices are since 1995. That's Quincy at my desk now, and there's all the identifiers of that mid-century architecture, from the small gardens, the flow of spaces indoor-outdoor, this is seated concrete, radiant heated floor, and then that's Quincy and Fred Emmons back in the studio. We actually feel that working in this building has had a very strong and positive effect on our work in terms of the engagement of landscape, the maintaining of domesticity within institutional space. And it also led to, maybe fortuitously or randomly, we connected with that legacy later on. This is Walter and Lee Annenberg at Sunnylands. This is in the mid-60s. It's 200 acres of irrigated turf in Rancho Mirage, and it's basically a golf course with a membership of 2. And we might not call that sustainable in these days, but the Annenbergs put that in trust so that on their passing, passed away a couple of years ago, this would go into a public trust for the Annenberg Foundation as a retreat and a house museum. And so we've just finished the restoration of this project, which will reopen to the public in March. And we're work with Mrs. Annenberg on developing a visitor center, museum, and cultural facility that would relate to this. And the challenge was she herself worked with Quincy Jones on this, and their first inclination was, let's just do a slightly smaller version of this for the visitor center, the same pink pyramidal roof, the same irrigated landscape. And over the design process, we were able to get to a point of abstracting these things more and converting her, and I certainly credit her with a complete change of her orientation at 92 years old, from firmly embedded into this notion of landscape to a completely sustainable landscape. This house also held a collection of Impressionist paintings, which is now in a series of galleries at the Metropolitan Museum. So our response to that was as to sort of an abstraction and as a precursor to the Sunnylands rather than an imitation of it, where we took the signature large floating roof, simplified it, didn't put the pyramid on it, let the mountains be the pyramid, and essentially made it a garden, a framing device for looking at the landscape. And so as you enter here, the view is framed by these lava walls. There are lava walls in the main house, and the space is essentially 4 boxes that surround a space that looks out to the landscape in all 4 directions. And the landscape, again, Mrs. Annenberg came from the point of, yes, there's going to be flowers and irrigated turf and the same kind of landscape that there was at Sunnylands, and eventually we got around to a completely indigenous desert landscape, which when it comes to maturity won't require any irrigation, and the project will achieve is designed for a net zero with a photovoltaic field and a geothermal field, and a whole assortment of other energy savings strategies. I was fortunate enough to have a sabbatical at the American Academy in Rome, and very proud by the fact that it was actually a named fellowship from Frank Israel, who was one of the great teachers and supporters of this of UCLA's school and now department, and this fellowship was named for him. And I must say, I have to make a commercial here. I want you all to apply for that fellowship. They need the best people they can have to keep up the quality of the community that's there, and it's a marvelous institution and opportunity. This is the McKim White Building on the Janiculum Hill in Rome, and this is basically what you do there. You eat. What I did there was, among other things, I designed 6 museums that nobody's asked me to do yet. And so I'm just going to go through those. When one is in Rome, and in fact my subject matter was about time and layering, and the architects of the 50s in Italy who did a whole series of museum renovations that you're probably familiar with, a number of those by Carlo Scarpa. But there was a very poetic response to their traditional architecture in a completely contemporary way. And so I began to think about how that strategy applies to our time and our buildings, which are maybe not so glamorous as those in Rome, but all the same time, there's going to be new layers of life in that sense of memory of the ruins. Our buildings are going to age and need new uses too, and so I began to look around at a series of modern building types and how those might be converted to a museum. This is a big box store, a Walmart or a Target, and again applying that notion of the packing problem into the simple box. And this is dealing with the surface of layering a kind of debossed pattern on the outside of these tilt-up walls with a tightly framed entrance into the box, carving away courtyards, and then in this particular case it's based on the notion of a private collection, and with different densities of display, from the high-density storage to the medium-density kind of salon-style study collection to the more traditional open, lower-density gallery museum-type display. And again, with all indirect lighting. The Uffizi is, probably the most famous office building converted to a museum. Uffizi literally means office. It was the Medici's administrative offices in Florence, and it wasn't designed as a museum. And so I looked at, what is the kind of inglorious equivalent of that in our time, and think of the Tishman Building and all those other buildings in West LA. They're by the thousands and thousands around the country. And could one take these kinds of generic office buildings and find a site, find a museum inside of them? So we looked at the way you carve away at the facade, and with this kind of two-dimensional positive, negative carving away, begin to look at the composition of the whole facade rather than simply the grid of each individual pane of glass, and reveal the public spaces of a museum that begins to climb from the outside surrounding a outdoor gallery and wrap its way up into the building and crawl up through the building through a series of spaces carved out of that set of typical floor plates. This is coming up. I'm wrapping around this outdoor room, looking down into it, and then coming into the space. These buildings actually are robust enough that without too much stiffening, one could carve away quite a bit of the fabric inside and create dramatic 2-, 3-, 4-story spaces, as well as longer and wider vistas than one would expect in these kinds of buildings. By simply taking out alternate floors, the gallery spaces actually could be quite perfectly proportioned between the cores and the outside walls. And then using entire floors as light boxes to bring light down into the inner spaces. Most major European cities, and a lot of ours, have these so-called gasometer structures, which are large structures from the 19th century that were used to store natural gas, and most of them are kind of sitting around disused now. It's the largest structure in Rome, and when you look through the Rome cityscape, you see St. Peter's dome, and you see this thing in Testaccio, and I couldn't help but think about this as this huge object and how one could inhabit that space, and thought about putting the object within the skeleton, and finding essentially using that as the wrapper around the building. The smaller diameter of this, I became fixated with certain diameters, and that's one of the things about looking at architecture of the 16th, 17th century, is that it happened to be heavily based on dimensions and proportions. The diameter of the Pantheon is one of the key dimensions that I became fixated with. It was the largest dome for about it took about 900 years for technology to surpass what the Romans were able to do in about 500 AD with that structure. And so I used that as sort of arbitrarily that dimension, not exceeding that dimension, to sleeve in this mixed-use building, which is a museum, an office complex, and a set of kind of incubator penthouse buildings sitting on top. And this is, again, that being fascinated with packing, on how one could pack a museum into a circle. In this case, lit by the donut-like well that runs down in the center of that upper structure, and the space between the inner circle and the outer circle. Another problem that has fascinated me was that of the Encyclopedic Museum, and this, you could say, is my late entry to the LACMA competition. And when you're sitting on the plane for hours and hours and hours and hours, you keep seeing these little maps that the airlines put in the back of the magazines. And so I tore up one of them and was looking at the continents and thinking about how that might be an organizing principle for a museum. And in this, thinking about the hemispheres of the Western Hemisphere, Europe and Africa and Asia, as a way of organizing the museum's in geographic terms, as opposed to chronological terms. And so typical encyclopedic museums tend to be, at least in the West, much more heavily weighted on the art of Europe than other areas, and so that bar in the center of the building tends to be much larger than the Americas and Asia, even though the production of those cultures might be at least greater. The collections that live in museums tend to be much larger in the Europe and Mediterranean and Northern Europe area. So that accounted for the proportions of these. But also, through time, one has to get to the interconnections, and through time now, contemporary art is really not based on geography. It's worldwide, and curators are also much more interested in thematic curation of objects by media or by theme as opposed to geography. And so this building becomes almost like a Mobius strip that wraps around itself, so that the interconnections of thematic galleries and contemporary connect kind of seamlessly to this continuous circuit around the geography. So this is just walking through around and through some of the signature spaces inside, with always the transitions moving up from one level to the next. Another notion that, again, relates to probably flying too much is thinking about airports and land art. This is Walter Di Maria's lightning field, 1 mile by 1 kilometer, and this is superimposed on the Rome airport. And this is Michael Heiser's effigy tumuli, superimposed on the Pittsburgh airport. And one of the things that one is aware of, you go to these art fairs in Basel and around the world, is it's becoming, the art world has become this completely international culture of people that are moving around and going to art fairs in all these major cities of the world. And I thought about essentially making a museum out of all the airports of all the art fair cities, and doing the installations of land art in those places. And these are things that are rarely seen, or in fact were never built in the first place, where you would always get a chance to see that artwork from the air. And then you have these vast areas of landscape which are within a precinct where there are literally millions of people coming through each year, and taking what is among the most inaccessible artworks and bringing them into the most highly accessible situations. One of my fascinations, I think I share with a lot of architects, is of Morandi. And one, I think, inevitably looks at his paintings and thinks about a cityscape. And so one of the museums had to be a museum for Morandi, because Morandi's museum right now is basically in a couple of rooms in the city hall in Bologna. And his paintings, I think, so compellingly suggest a landscape of forms, or a building or a cityscape, that I had to go through that exercise, so that those forms above ground are all light cannons to a series of subterranean chambers that interconnect, and subterranean gardens, so that there was always a relationship between light and garden within these small chambers that related to the size of Morandi's work. And then, of course, there's the 800-pound gorilla, Palladio. And one of the things that was the beauty of a study opportunity like that, is the ability to sort of be in the library and read randomly and make those kinds of connections that you don't often make. One of them was the fact that the Villa Rotunda was built at almost the exact same time as the Katsura detached palace. And they both, I think, have this outstanding quality of using a generic space in a very poetic way. And in Palladio, of course, there's the geometry, the perfection of the geometry, but you look at this set of generic spaces and you don't know, or it doesn't matter, what room is the bathroom, what room is a kitchen, what room is a living room. It's just generic space. And then the same is true in Japanese villa architecture. I'm sure Toshi can correct me on that. So I had to think about Palladios as a starting point, a theme for a contemporary house for art, and layering these generic spaces around a courtyard in the center, and thinking about it also in terms of that northern Italian landscape against the foothills of the Alps. Instead of being the one box, simply showing the individual rooms as a series of pavilions wrapping around a courtyard. One of the other glories of art of that era is that it's not, a building by Palladio was really not thought of as a pure form of geometry. Every surface was meant to be painted. The murals are an integral part of the architecture, and so we thought about how the surface needs to be dissolved with image, and also applying some of those devices that we talked about of bringing light and controlled view in a very non-Palladian way into this set of rooms. And lastly, I was also taken by the purely arbitrary realization that the building that we did for Otis is square in plan, and it's 152 feet square, which is exactly the diameter of the Pantheon. And by coincidence, the Otis asked me to do an exhibit at the 10-year anniversary of the building last summer. And after thinking about it for a while, I realized that I really didn't want to hang drawings or models in the gallery, but I wanted to think about that relationship and simply make an installation of the juxtaposition of that circle with the square. And so we built a fence which moves from outside to the inside, and is inscribed or printed on the inner surface with hundreds of the drawings that I did when I was in Rome, and it's essentially a tabernacle or a temporary tent that wrapped in and around the box of the building. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
I'd like to take questions. Oh, okay.
I'm glad I answered all your questions.
Okay, I mean, okay.
Do you always use the watercolor sketches? Are those presentation, or are those done for your own?
Those are, well, honestly, yes, they're both. I do them on my own, and I don't show those they're not presentation material, I don't show them to clients. And yet there are many projects that I don't do them, and I was certainly, being in Rome allowed me to indulge that to a much greater degree than I normally get to do, so I did hundreds while I was there, and as Toshi mentioned, the Cella Gallery offered me the chance to show those, and so that stimulated a whole other year of painting, frenetic painting activity. So it actually does let me think about some projects in a way, as you can see, that our work tends to have a really primal quality to it. And the choice of watercolor to me is also purposeful in that it forces one to have a degree of loss of control. And I think that's always helpful in creating that kind of ambiguity and quality in the perception of space and light that is part of our work.
I was wondering a little bit about the process you go through in designing the parts and designing the kind of massing of the project. So you showed more images of composed spaces that were inside the massing. And I was wondering if those are things that are kind of being developed alongside the kind of building organization, or whether you design the kind of building organization before you develop the kind of interior set of spaces. Because it seems like there might be a kind of feedback loop between designing those rooms, which are very kind of always carefully composed, and the overall organization and its set of parts. So I was wondering just about the process of getting them.
Well, interestingly, I didn't think our process would change after such a long time. We've been doing this for quite a while, and actually, as I mentioned, I worked in Frank Gehry's office early on, and he is, as you may know, a compulsive model maker, and I made models when I was there, and there would be hundreds and piles of models, and I never thought I would think about making things in a different way. And yet the tools that you all are using here affect us as well. And in fact, our use of the physical model is actually diminished quite a bit. And that we are now enjoying the efficiency and speed of being able to build the models virtually and then sit down there and spin them around and open them up. And we also, quite pragmatically, we have to operate that way to be in business, in the construction industry, and under the parameters we have to work with our clients. We have to use these tools. And yet, so it's changed the way we've designed somewhat, but I think because our design DNA is pretty well established by now, there are certain things that are going to get into the project almost no matter what. So as I said, we have this kind of domestic way of looking at spaces in capturing amenities of views, of light, of intimacy and warmth. And so that set of tools is, coming into play as a set of general strategies while we may be planning a building that's a library or a museum or an academic building. And then when the opportunities, as the plan begins to gel, those opportunities begin to make their way into the building. So it's almost like those things are being done separately, but then they're dropped, one set of strategies being dropped in as the building is gelling, maybe as a set of functional spaces.
This will be the last one.
So you talked about sort of framing in your projects, framing experiences, but then with you unbuilt museum projects, it seems like you're taking somebody else's space and then working within their own frame.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever consider that with your own projects while you're working with them, or afterwards? Sort of the repurposing possibilities?
Well, a couple of times we have done projects where we had to build our own ruins. And I think that interaction between, which is, fundamental surrealist strategy of the interaction of incompatible things, sometimes those incompatibilities have to be fabricated. And so, like on the beach house project and in some of our residential work, we built something that we had to, we designed a fragment essentially that was part of the project, but it wasn't old, it wasn't there originally, but we built it to interact with. And so, for example, that series of columns on the beach house project was a memory. We made it physical so we could interact, use that to bounce off and interact with. So it's sometimes it's a strategy if we don't have the actuality to work with it, and sometimes it's not a physical frame or structure that you have to deal with. It's a set of forces from the outside, the site forces, the neighboring building forces, the social forces around the building. So we talk about our design process as being this bifurcated process of the architecture is this membrane that occurs between the internal forces of the building and the external forces.
Okay, so thank you very much. Please give another round of applause.